today and tomorrow. So we have these lectures, and they're funded a little bit by the Dunning family. And Guy B. Dunning was an evangelist years ago who literally, when he was in Nebraska and in this area, sometimes was preaching for 4 or 5 churches on a weekend because there just were no pastors. There were no people to fill those pulpits. And he felt that it would be very important then to establish a school here in Nebraska as a place to train people for ministry so that those churches could be better served and even more churches could be planted because of that. So he served as the founder and the original president of the college and really got it off the ground. Being a college administrator probably wasn't really his thing, I guess. I don't know, Bill, would that be a fair thing to say, that he moved on to other things? And the college began to bring in very professional people, but we still honor the vision of Guy B. Dunning, and we do this by this lectureship. So we try to bring in somebody who is related to the heritage of the college in some ways, and most of you know that's the Christian church and Churches of Christ. Sometimes we have somebody talk about a topic in that area. This case, the person is from that tradition, but his topic is going to be a little bit broader. So today and tomorrow, I'm very pleased that our speaker for the Dunning Lectures is Dr. Jeff Miller, who is a graduate of Nebraska Christian College and went and did master's degree at Emmanuel School of Religion, now Emmanuel Christian Seminary in Tennessee, and then earned a PhD at the University of Denver. So a very distinguished graduate of the college. He has been teaching in the Bible department at Milligan College for 19 years and teaches some of the same things that I do. Are you teaching Old Testament survey this? So those of you that just suffered through with me for 2 sections, OT survey, if you want to complain to somebody, talk to Dr. Miller afterwards. He won't be very sympathetic. So anyway, just a wonderful person. His mother and father, Bill and Dorothy Miller, are here this morning, and thank you for being here. Came down from Norfolk, and Bill Miller taught for many years at Nebraska Christian College, so we're just honored to have you here with us also today. And I have the privilege then to start the lectureship by again ringing our alumni bell. So would you give a welcome to Dr. Jeff Miller?
So that was the second occurrence of the alumni bell, is that right? Yes. And the first was Troy Justice? I went to school with Troy. I hope that this will be almost as interesting as whatever he said. Yeah, thanks for the warm welcome. My wife Dana, who's over here, and I have felt very warmly welcomed, including last night at midnight when we were let in the building, this morning at breakfast, and just talking to students, staff, and faculty. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. It'd be worth mentioning, my parents were mentioned and introduced, that they were friends of Guy B. and Anna Dunning, and my mom's parents were decades-long friends with Guy B. and Anna Dunning. I never met them because I'm young and spry. I've heard that there is a student here, let's get this one thing out of the way, from Wymore, Nebraska. Is that true? Okay. When this is over, could you come say hi to my mom and my wife? They're both from Wymore. Okay, great, thank you. Swap some stories. Okay, so the screen is telling you the titles of today's and tomorrow's lectures, and the big title is From Papyrus to Pixels. I first thought it was going to be From Papyrus to Parchment to Paper to Pixels. That's a little crazy, though. 4 things that the Bible has existed on over the centuries. Today, the Bible before paper, which is just simply a way of saying we're going to talk about old things today, manuscripts. And then tomorrow, it's the Bible in your lifetime, so newer things, paper and pixels. And I've already established with our slide person a code word for advancing slides. It's simply please. Please? There we go. Today's outline is 4 reasons English Bible translations differ from one another. You've known since the first time you sat in Sunday school that English Bible translations are not the same. And we're up over 100 English translations available now. And so I'm going to give you 4 reasons that they're different. There are more than 4. These are the 4 that I decided to talk about. And then I'm going to focus in on one of the 4. So the first point there is kind of an extended introduction. And that one is that manuscripts differ from one another. So it would make sense, wouldn't it, that translations from the manuscripts differ from one another. And then 2 common misconceptions. And then what can we do? And then hopefully there'll be 10 minutes for some questions and answers at the end. That's where we're going. Please. Reason number 1 that translations differ is that all Bible translators are biased in different ways and to different degrees. And that's all I'm going to say about that right now, because that's tomorrow's lecture. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that I sincerely believe that tomorrow's lecture is better than today's. And so there is hope for this situation you got yourself into. Okay? So that's reason number 1, and it's tomorrow's lecture. Please. Reason number 2 is smoothing between the Testaments. All English Bibles, some of them a little bit, some of them a lot, try to smooth out the translation, not just between the Testaments, but across from Genesis to Revelation. They want it all to sound like really good modern English. And so there's some smoothing out. And the biggest place where that becomes evident is the giant gap between Old Testament and New Testament. I'll eventually explain why there's an aircraft carrier on the slide, okay? And so let me just give you one of many examples. Now, most examples are tiny little things that wouldn't really merit a slide in a lecture, okay? But this one, I think, would be good enough to grab your attention. So here we have the English Standard Version, the ESV, and it says Red Sea. You can see that, right? I should have made it red. I made it purple, but whatever. And it wasn't hard for me to find a Bible that says that Moses crossed the Red Sea and that Pharaoh took his army into the Red Sea and they drowned in the Red Sea, because almost all Bibles say that. Amen? All right. Here's the interesting thing. The Old Testament never says that those things happened at the Red Sea. You're an Old Testament survey. You probably know this. My Old Testament survey students don't know it. It's beyond them. But this is NCC, all right? You know this. Okay? The Old Testament, not the New, the Old Testament never says that they came up to the shore of the Red Sea and the army was behind them and he put out his staff. I mean, it says all that stuff. It just doesn't say Red Sea. It says the Sea of Reeds. Now, if you look at the next translation there, it's the NIV, published in 2011. It has a Red Sea, and then it has a footnote that says, or the Sea of Reeds. The thing is, nobody's really sure what the Sea of Reeds is today. And nobody was really sure what the Sea of Reeds was 2,000 years ago. It had already been so long since Moses that it was kind of lost to them. And so then look at the CEB, that's the Common English Bible, published in 2011, and it says Reed Sea, and it's moved Red Sea down to the footnote. So what's going on? There's actually 2 reasons for this, and I'm not going to take the time to give them both. They're overlapping reasons. I'm going to give one of the 2 reasons. It's because of a guy named Stephen, and most of you know that Stephen was stoned and killed for his faith in the early chapters of the book of Acts. And you might recall that before that happened, he rattled off a history of his own people. And in that history of his own people, he mentioned that Moses led the people across the Red Sea. And that's in the New Testament. And so your English Bible translators have done you the favor of changing the Old Testament to match the New Testament so that you don't have to confront an oddity as you read the Bible. And this particular example has been so prominent in Bible history that it's an odd thing to mention. I said there was 2 reasons. That's just one. They're overlapping. I can tell the other one in the cafeteria if you want. The reason there's a picture of an aircraft carrier there is because that's the Gulf of Suez. That's the Suez Canal, which goes from the northern tip of the Red Sea up to the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, that wasn't there back then. But back then, there was about a 100-mile stretch of land where there was lots of lakes and seas and marshes. And probably the Reed Sea is somewhere in there. So I'm not denying that it happened. I'm not denying the miracle. As a matter of fact, what I'm telling you is the Bible says it was the Sea of Reeds. So that's another reason number 2. It's not really the topic for today, but we're getting into it here. Reasons that English Bibles differ from one another so many, many times. Please. Reason number 3. Translators very often have to encounter this question. Are we going to say what it says, or are we going to say what it means? And sometimes it's a really easy choice, and it doesn't stress them out. But other times it becomes a very difficult thing to make. And so different Bible translators will make different decisions, and then our English Bibles all end up being different. Have you ever heard the word firkin? This is the word for the day. Do you see it there in the King James Version underlined? The story of the wedding at Cana. Jesus turns water into wine, and the water is in these big pots, these big stone pots. And the King James is kind enough to point out that those pots held 2 or 3 firkins apiece. The Greek just says like 2 or 3 measures. And apparently in the 17th century, when the King James was made, they figured out that that measure was about a firkin. And so am I correct that you don't want your modern Bible to say that? You much prefer the CSB, which most of these slides are just randomly grabbing translations. There's so many. This one is the newest one in the world. Its publication date is 2017, the Christian Standard Bible. It says 20 or 30 gallons. And that's what a lot of translations made in your lifetime, even my lifetime, say. So, am I correct that you very, very, very much prefer Bible translators to say what it means, 20 or 30 gallons, rather than what it says, 2 or 3 firkins? Can I get a second amen? All right. Please. There are other times when you don't want that to happen. You very much want the Bible to say what it says, not what it means. So, for example, we all know, most of us have known since we were small children, that Jesus was dead for 3 days and then rose. But have you done the math? It was actually about 40 hours from Friday to Sunday. Well, already we would count that as 2 days. But it's several hours into Friday, and it's first thing in the morning, Sunday, even before sunup. And to be honest, we don't know when he rose. We just know when the women went and noticed that he rose. And so it's at most 40 hours. But you don't want to change our Easter hymns, do you? You don't want anybody to go back into the Bible and yank out the 3 days and swap it in for give or take 40 hours. And so this is the dilemma that Bible translators face sometimes. And the 2 examples I've given you are really easy ones. Like in this case, yes, say what it says. In this case, yes, say what it means. But then there's 100 or so other places where when they make that decision, they put themselves at risk of somebody criticizing and jumping their case on the internet, etc. So that's reason number 3, and it happens a lot. Please. Reason number 4, which is the topic for this lecture, is that the manuscripts are different. I'm delighted to say that I've already talked with Mike Cahill. I know that in Bible Tools, you learn about manuscripts. Some of this will therefore be repeat, or if you haven't had the class yet, you'll repeat it later. But repetition is good, especially when it comes to a very complicated topic that only gets brought up once every decade or less, right? So here's an example. We know the story of Mary and Martha from Luke chapter 10, and you've probably heard some sermons on that. It's a story that when you find out on Sunday morning that's going to be the sermon, you really don't know where it's going, right? Because it's an interesting enough story that you can take it in different ways. I want to point out that the translations differ, and the two that I've given you on the wall, on the screen, are recent ones. It's not like I'm comparing the King James to the NIV. These are both in your lifetime, both in the last few years. Have you ever noticed that some Bibles have the word also in verse 39? She had a sister named Mary who also sat at the Lord's feet. Well, if the also means also, which I assume it does, then both these women sat at the Lord's feet. Right? Got to rewrite that sermon. We're more used to hearing the one on the left, where Martha's doing one thing and Mary's doing another thing. And it's not a difference that a choice that a translator made. The only choice the translator made was which manuscript to follow. Because there are many, many manuscripts that say the left version, and there are many, many manuscripts that say the right version. Now, if I put the story up there, you would see that as it goes on, if you accept the version with the also, it starts to make a little less sense because it does say more, right? It does talk about Martha's reaction to Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet and Jesus' comments to Martha about it. Just one example of why translations differ. Now, there was a day about 18 months ago when Dr. Krause and I exchanged an email and I gave him the titles to these lectures. And they've changed. There's still the titles that are on the website, that's why I'm mentioning this. And the titles were, the first one was Something All Christians Should Do at Least Once. That's the next slide, go ahead please. And that's Look at Manuscripts. And then the next lecture was Something You Should Do All the Time. And that is Compare Translations. Which I'm talking to the choir here. You own Logos, right? Do you say Logos? Logos? You own that thing. And so you're fully equipped to do your study with 2, 3, 4 translations open. And what I'm saying is that sometimes the small differences, the presence or the absence of the word also, may change the way you approach a whole text for your preaching, your teaching, your devotional life. Okay? So, something every Christian should do at least once. Not many Christians spend considerable time looking at manuscripts of the Bible. Some go their whole life without thinking about it once. And that's fine. I'm not so eggheady that I'm suggesting that you all need to fully invest yourself in the study of the manuscripts. There's a lot more to do. Nevertheless, I do believe every Christian who can should take the time to do so at least once. And every Christian who's going to get a degree from Nebraska Christian College should do it at least twice in the Dunning Lectures and in Bible Tools. Okay? Why? Why do this? Well, it's helpful to get a basic feel for what the Bible is made of, what it was before it became a collection of numerous books bound together in a fancy cover or uploaded to the Diamond package, which I assume you don't own that one because it's thousands of dollars. You could aspire to the Diamond package. Please. This slide is here at risk of my family chuckling. My first car was a 68 Camaro. That's not it, but it's exactly like it. Okay? And one of the reasons that was a bad idea, and I didn't keep it all that long, was that I don't know anything about cars other than how to look at them, how to drive them. Every time I would be at a gas station or a rest stop or just park to get out and go in, somebody would come up. Okay, not every time, but scores of times. Hey, what year is that? Or very often they would know. Is it all original parts? I don't know. I just bought it. What's under the hood? A motor? I mean, you can look if you want. I assume there's a motor. And so then I would open it up they would look and they'd go, oh man, I think it was a 327. That car, does that sound right? At that time in my life, I did not know what that meant. Oh, it's a 327. Awesome. So it's a 3-digit number is what you're telling me. I had no idea. And so one of the reasons that I had no right to own that excellent car was that I had no knowledge of it beyond it's red, it's kind of loud, change the oil once in a while. I mean, take it to Jiffy Lube once in a while. Of course, I didn't change oil myself. How embarrassing that I set myself up to be a classic car guy, but didn't know one single intelligent fact about what was under the hood or the transmission or anything. Please. So how odd would it be if you got a degree from Nebraska Christian College and you had never looked at a manuscript? You skipped that day in Bible Tools. You didn't know. You kind of intuitively knew because you're not stupid, right? But you'd never had any experience with the fact that our Bible comes from something. It comes from a many, many centuries long process that began with papyrus documents from long, long ago. So let's just look at that for a moment. This is called Papyrus 46 for no particular reason. I mean, because it was the 46th one they numbered, I suppose. It's from the early 3rd century, meaning 200, 210, 220, something like that. And the fancy word I like to say is scriptio continua, a fancy word that just means continuous script. It's a way of saying they don't put any spaces between the words. When you start looking at New Testament manuscripts, that's probably the first thing you notice, is there's no space between the words. And almost no one in any of the congregations that all of us attend has ever had that thought before, that there are no spaces between words in New Testament manuscripts. It is not the most important thing about the Bible, I understand. It's not on the top 10 list of most important things about the Bible. But it's worth knowing if you're going to be an educated Christian leader. Just one basic fact about it. Please. Now, let's say that you know it now. You even remember the fancy words. Somebody comes up to you at your church on Sunday and they say, hey, I heard somebody say that there's no spaces between words in the New Testament, in the original text. And you said, yeah, we study that at school. I know that. I even know the Latin for it. It's scriptio continua. What if they say to you then, well, do all, most, many, some, a few New Testament manuscripts have no spaces? Is it just Greek? What about Latin? What about Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament? What about Hebrew manuscripts? Did they divide the words between the lines? Did they have hyphens? Did they have syllable rules? What about other Greek manuscripts? Is this a New Testament thing, or did Plato and Philo and all those other guys do it? When did they start putting spaces in the words? They must have eventually done it. Was it with the printing press? Was it before that? Was it after that? Was it hard to read that way? Did they have special training to do so? Did they put dots between, dashes between, slashes between? Did they have capital letters? Did they have punctuation? Did they have paragraph divisions? Why in the world did they write that way? And every one of these questions has been asked of me. And you'd feel a little awkward, wouldn't you, if somebody just started asking you and you're like, wait a second, I just saw a screen one day in chapel. I don't know. So I'm just illustrating that it's worth doing once. Hey, if you're an NCC student, it's worth doing twice. Maybe 3 or 4 times. Somewhere down the line. You can't even imagine the day when you've got time to do something, can you? But someday it'll happen that you've got time. So just open up Wikipedia, type in Papyrus 46, and look at it for a while. Please. This is the same manuscript, and I've just blown it up to get a little bit closer look. The arrow coming in from the left is pointing at the title. It says, to the Hebrews. And so this is the place in this manuscript where it goes from Romans to Hebrews. The second arrow, the one on the top right coming in horizontally, is pointing at the last line of Romans. There's a lot of things that could be said about this, but we don't have all day, right? You do want to have lunch. Let me talk about the third arrow for 3 or 4 minutes. The third one, the one that's diagonal. That arrow is pointing at a word. I think you can see it. Your eyes are better than mine. That has been inserted between the lines. Can you see that from where you're sitting? Okay. It's the word our, O-U-R. It's the pronoun our. And there it stands, right above approximately where it ought to be. The reason I'm pointing this out to you is because it's just a really good basic introductory illustration of what happens as manuscripts get copied. Somebody probably forgot to put that word. The person who made the manuscript didn't put it in. And then noticed that he or she didn't put it in. And so they just stuck it above the line. You know, they didn't have erasers that worked anywhere near as well as ours, so you put it above the line. No big deal, right? Third amen? No big deal? Amen. The big deal comes along when somebody else copies that. Now they have a choice to make. So somebody else copies it, and they put it right where it is. If it's above the line, I'm a good scribe, I'm putting it above the line. Somebody else says, it's above the line, it doesn't belong there. It was added by somebody. I don't want that in my text. Somebody else says, I'm not sure what to do with that, but I don't want it messing up my line, so I'm going to scoot it over into the margin. Somebody else says, oh, I know exactly where that goes, because I know what Hebrews 1:1 says. And so they put it where it goes, except for that they're wrong. They put it before a word instead of after a word. And so somebody else comes along and says, I know where that goes. And they put it where it actually goes. And remember this guy? He put it in the margin. Somebody copies his manuscript 50 years later, and they see a word in the margin. And so some of them do what this one did, and they leave it out. And someone do what this one did, they leave it in the margin. And some do what this one did, and they put it before a word, and some put it after a word. But now that it's in the margin, there's a bigger variety of where it could go. It's now got 7 or 8 options, and where could the word our go? And so I wish I could go back to the year 220, 230, and say to this person, hey, invent the eraser, please. If you put that word our above the line, and then it's copied for 1,500 years, by the time it comes down to English Bible translators, I realize English doesn't exist yet, but work with me. There's going to be at least 10 different versions of what you just wrote. And we're going to have to spend all this time and money to figure it out. And that's just one illustration, I think a manageable illustration of what starts to happen when you decide to copy something by hand in multiple languages over 1,500 years. Okay? Please, let's move on. This picture deserves to be here because it's probably the oldest manuscript available, of the New Testament available in the world. There's another one that it's pretty close, you never know, but this one is regularly claimed to be the oldest. It's about the size of the palm of my hand. My hand's not very big. And it's got 5 verses on it. 3 on one side, 2 on the other. And none of those 5 verses are complete. You can see that it's pretty tattered and torn. This is all that remains of what presumably was the entire Gospel of John when it was created. At least the entire Gospel of John. It could have been Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. We don't know. And so I put it there because it's a super famous picture of a New Testament manuscript, because it's an illustration, because I've already said we ought to do it once in our lives, right? So I need to put up a picture or two to be fair to my early title. But also because it's going to be a helpful segue into the next few slides, where this lecture is going next. So please, let's go. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about 2 common misconceptions. If I weren't such a tactful fellow, I would say 2 stupid things people say. But that would be rude. 2 common misconceptions. One of them tends to be said by very conservative, Bible-loving people. One of them tends to be said by very cynical, Bible-doubting people. And I want to point out that neither one of them is very helpful to us coming to a better and better understanding of what manuscripts are and how they ought to be used. So common misconception number 1. This is what someone might say. We know that our Bibles are 99.99. They might throw in a couple more nines. Accurate because there are so crazy many manuscripts and they are so crazy early. And I use the words crazy there to kind of give the vibe of the person who would say this. I'm not a very exciting speaker. I need to use other words to communicate. People are fired up about this. Many of you have heard this line of reasoning. The reason we can depend upon the extreme accuracy of the Bible is, I just noticed you were here, hey, it is because there's so many manuscripts. The two numbers they'll throw out, and they're right, are 5,000. That's approximately how many Greek manuscripts there are. Sometimes they'll throw out 20,000. That's about approximately how many there are in Greek, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and 7 or 8 other languages. So either number works. Let's go on, please. The person I first heard say this by reading his book, and I've also heard him say it in public, is Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell has a website called www.josh.org. He's a very well-known, very gifted speaker and communicator. And this quote comes from his website. I just got it a few days ago from his website. F.F. Bruce makes the following observation. Now, F.F. Bruce wrote in the 1940s. He wrote this in the 1940s. The evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. Now, F.F. Bruce was a genius, and he was right when he said that. And what he said is still true to this very day. What he was pointing out was that no one who deals with manuscripts of like Homer, Plato, Herodotus, whatever, really has any right to doubt the high level of dependability and accuracy of the New Testament, because there's way more manuscripts of the New Testament than there are of those things, and there's way more scholars working on the manuscripts of the New Testament than of those things. And so Bruce, who himself was a classical scholar, was able to say, hey, you guys, knock it off. If you can't doubt the New Testament without doubting your own corpus, and then you're out of a job. Since he said that in the 40s, it's become a very common thing to say to make a similar but different point. The similar but different point is that our Bibles are pristinely accurate because there's so many manuscripts. Next slide, please. I would like to question that argument. First of all, the numbers have changed. This doesn't kill the argument. This just points out that we're not being very fair. Because every time somebody quotes this, they quote the 1943 numbers. But they're getting better and better. For example, in 1943, I'm skipping to the 4th bullet point there. F.F. Bruce said that Herodotus, there's only 8 manuscripts of Herodotus out there. And the earliest, the one is from 1300 A.D. And so you'll still find that on many websites today. However, the truth is, there's now 43. Still a small number, so the argument doesn't change. And the earliest one is 2nd century, rather than 13th, 14th century. So I'm simply saying, if you're going to use this argument, at least be fair, be honest, be intelligent, and use the right numbers. Much more importantly, the next bullet point, thousands of these manuscripts are not used in the making of your New Testament. Dr. Krause is nodding. Thank you. Not nodding off. Thank you. Nodding. Please understand, yes, it's true, there are 20,000-ish manuscripts of the New Testament available in multiple languages, but that does not mean that when a translation committee sits down to make a new Bible, they consult all of them. They consult a very small minority of them. The oldest ones, the best ones, based on a couple centuries of study, we have a pretty good idea of which ones are oldest and best. And so you see how it's an illogical thing to say? We've got boatloads of manuscripts. That's what makes our Bible the best. Oh, but by the way, we don't use 80% of them, except for that they sit in museums. And then there's a little danger, because the last bullet point on the screen. If you want to base your dependence in the New Testament on the number of manuscripts we have, and you also want to be a logical, sensible person, then you should probably start doubting the Old Testament. Which, of course, is not at all the point that F.F. Bruce was making or that this lecture is making, because the Old Testament doesn't have nearly as many manuscripts as the New Testament does. So this slide is called Questioning an Old Argument, just pointing out that we've kind of overdone this way of looking at things. Let's go to the next one, please. Another way to question that old argument, there's a lot of information on that. Start staring, and I'll try to explain it. Just how numerous are New Testament manuscripts? And it should say Greek New Testament manuscripts. Let's try to wrap our mind around how many are there? How numerous are they? Well, it's true, there's about 5,000. But remember the little one, the size of my not very big hand? I said it was a segue to where we're going. That's one manuscript. It's 5 incomplete verses, and it's one of the 5,000 manuscripts. So you have to understand that when we say there's 5,000, that doesn't mean there's 5,000 of Matthew 1:1, 5,000 of Matthew 1:2, 5,000 of Matthew 1:3. It also doesn't mean that they're all early. So left-hand column, all together, there's more than 5,000 manuscripts. How many are from the 2nd to early 3rd centuries? About 12. How many are from about the 3rd century? About 50. How many are from the 4th to 5th? About 90. So add that together, you've got what, 162? Did I do that right? I think I did that right. There's about 162 manuscripts that are within 500 years of when they were written. And that's a whole lot fewer than 5,000. There are 5,000, but look at the bottom row. Most of them come from the 8th to the 16th century, where you are approaching and moving beyond a whole millennium since they were written. So, middle column, what if we were to just stop talking about manuscripts as a whole, but what about just take a book, for example, James? How many manuscripts of James? If we're going to say there's 5,000 of the New Testament, does that mean there's 5,000 of James? Well, no, there's about 800 of James. Look at the bottom middle. How many are from the 2nd to early 3rd centuries? None. How many are from the 3rd century, mid to late 3rd century? 3. And then there's 8 from the 4th to 5th. There's 1.5. I can't remember exactly why I said half, but I did. And so do you see how if you're going to devote yourself to www.josh.org, to that argument, that the reason we depend on our Bible, the reason it's dependable to us is because there's so many manuscripts, then you should probably stop depending on James chapter 2. A man comes into the assembly, he's got gold rings, and you say, sit here in the front, but somebody else comes in and they're poor, and you say, sit at my feet or at my footstool. Have you not? Okay, you know this story, James chapter 2. How many times is that attested in our early manuscripts? Well, none from the 2nd or 3rd century. We have 4 from the 4th to 5th century. There seems to be a glut in the 6th to 7th. And then we've got 750 from the Middle Ages. I'm pointing out that the argument doesn't hold water. There are reasons to depend in your New Testament. It's just that it's not because there's 20,000 manuscripts. That's not the reason. All right? Now, I didn't come 1,000 miles to tell you not to depend on your New Testament. All right? That could be the dismal end of the Dunning Lectures series. Okay? There is another misconception, and let's go to that right now. It's the opposite. Misconception number 2, please. We are so crazy far removed from the original text that our translations are woefully inaccurate. This is the other side. If I ever do this again, I think I'll put a pendulum picture in here, okay? The pendulum swings all the way over to people who would say, you can't trust this thing. I mean, there's just little scraps of papyrus from 1,800 years ago, and you can't trust it. Please, next slide. I won't read this to you. It's not worth my time. But for example, here's a guy who is exaggerating and lying. I would think he was lying. He's surely more intelligent than what it says. He's pointing out in an extravagant way in Newsweek in 2014 that you absolutely cannot depend on your Bible. There's no way we could know what it really says. And he has swung the pendulum way over here, and it's ridiculous. It is sad that his employer, his editor, would let this be put into such a well-known publication. And so my next couple of slides are going to try to find a way to determine whether or not, please go ahead, whether or not our New Testaments are dependable, our Greek ones, because of course the English ones won't be if the Greek ones aren't. It's really hard to count variants. Variants means places where the manuscript's different. The people who are trying to count them haven't even really fully decided how to count them. Like that example I gave about the word hour, it's one word. Is that one manuscript, one variation? Or do we count all the ways that it manifests itself? Do we count all the manuscripts in which it manifests itself? But nevertheless, a few very intelligent and Bible-believing scholars have landed on the number 400,000. There's somewhere very loosely in the range of 400,000 differences in your Bible. And newsflash, there's way fewer than 400,000 words in your New Testament. And so essentially every word of your New Testament, somewhere in the vast manuscript tradition, has been tweaked, changed, scooted, reordered, misspelled, or something. And so then we have to ask these other questions. Which ones are meaningful? There are many, 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 many that have no difference. Spelling differences. The name John, for example, can be spelled 2 or 3 ways. That word hour, the one that I used earlier, can be spelled in 2 ways. And it doesn't change the meaning at all. It's just that they didn't have dictionaries. And of course, the manuscripts are from a 1600 year span of time. So of course, spelling is changing. So giant numbers of these 400,000, like way more than 300,000 of these 400,000, can immediately be disregarded as just the small tweaks of languages over the course of time. Which ones are viable? I mean, there are places in the manuscripts where it just says something crazy, something that we shouldn't be believing or that makes no sense. Well, they're not viable, meaning that no scholar actually looks at that and thinks for more than 5 seconds about whether it belongs in the Bible. Scribes made mistakes. And when they make mistakes, it's very often very easy to see, oh, look, they made a mistake. They copied a word twice. They copied a verse twice. Sometimes they copy a column twice or skip one. And so many thousands of variants can just be quickly disregarded as not viable. And then what we're left with is about 1/4 of 1% of the variants are both meaningful and viable. But when I say meaningful, I mean meaningful for translators. I mean, it's the kind of thing that a translator has to make a decision about what to print. But a lot of those are still not meaningful for you. One that hundreds of times, I'm tempted to say thousands, but I don't want to exaggerate. Hundreds of times you have the word Christ swapped out for the word Jesus, swapped out for the word Lord. And that's meaningful to a translator because they need to know which one to use. But it doesn't change the meaning of the story that's being told, right? And so we can go way down below 1/4 of 1% and way down below 1,000 to get down to the number that are really concerning to us. I should have put another bullet point. How many are concerning to us? It's a very small number. Next slide, please. Here's one way to start to get a feel for it. I have good testimony from your professor, Cahill, that those of you who have had Bible tools have heard that the most common Greek New Testament has an ABCD rating system. Now, not everybody's had that part of that class yet. I don't know if you remember it, but he's told me you've heard it, okay? And so basically, most people who own a Greek New Testament own one that tells you in the footnotes what are the places that we had to make a decision, the people doing the work. And they give it a quick ABC rating so that you don't have to be a genius to figure it out. A means we had to make a decision, but we're positive we made the right one. B means we had to make a decision, but we're pretty doggone sure we made the right one. C means, okay, there's 5 of us who made the decision, and 1 or 2 of us don't agree. Because there's an odd number for a reason, and we voted and we don't agree. And D means we don't know what's going on. We're not sure how to address this issue. Like, so, for example, if you have a verse that has 20 different readings, and you have 5 people voting on which of the 20, it kind of just ends up being a D reading because it's just kind of a complicated situation. So I'm very fortunate to have on my shelf my dad's Greek New Testament from 1966. Thank you, I'm taking good care of it. In that Bible, there were 687 C readings and 120 D ratings. Let's call those estimates because I only counted them once. I'm not going to count them twice. Then I have the 5th edition. That was the first edition. I have the 5th edition sitting on my shelf. And 361 of those C ratings are still C ratings. And 7 of the 120 are D ratings. Here's what they did, and they didn't really intend to do. In 1966, when they called those C's and D's, it was basically an open invitation to all New Testament scholars in the world. It was a way of saying, hey, you want something to study? Study this. Because we don't know what to do with these. And so that's what's been happening ever since, and before, true. And so over the course of time, we're gaining more and more confidence in the wording of the Greek New Testament. That's one way to look at it. I think it's helpful. It's honest about the fact that there are 7 places where 5 of the most intelligent New Testament scholars in the world simply say, we don't know what to print. So I'm being honest with you about that. But you should be happy to know that there was 120 in 1966, right? And so things are getting better as time goes along. Now, there's a clock up there, and it's 12 o'clock. And so let's skip the next slide, because it's just another way of looking at the same thing that I just did. And let's go to the one that says, what can we do about all this? And there's only one more after this, and it says Q&A, questions and answers. So let's go to questions and answers, but I'll leave that one up there in case it prompts any questions. And then we'll go to lunch in about 10 minutes, okay? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. And so I wanted to point out, we brought over from the library, we have 2 reproductions of pages, leaves from a very, very famous Christian manuscript called the Codex Sinaiticus that's in the British Museum. So when he's talking about the letters being run together, scripto continuo, you can take a look over there and see some of the features of those just on display here. So does anybody have a question? Yes, Brody?
Which is your personal favorite Bible manuscript?
Oh, I thought you were going to say translation, but what? Oh, okay. You already. I thought you were asking my favorite manuscript. This would be an interesting question I've never fielded before. What is my favorite translation? Okay, Dr. Krause knows a lot about English Bible translations, so the pressure is on right now.
What do you use in class?
I would say, first of all, to this question, that the NIV 2011 is as good an English translation as has ever been made.
Good answer. Good answer.
Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean they don't have their biases, but it's an excellent translation. For our Old Testament New Testament survey classes at Milligan College, we use the Common English Bible. I mean, that's their textbook. It's a study Bible. They don't buy Logos. And that's because it's also very good. It has the Apocrypha, and it's modern language, like it's contractions and, non-Bible-y words. So both of those are very good. But if I had to do the whole desert island scenario, I'd probably just grab my NIV and jump in the boat.
Okay, good. Another question right here, John. Microphone here.
So I've heard something
Wait just a second. There you go.
I've heard something cited before that with early church letters from from the beginning of the church to 500 or so, that we could recreate almost all of the New Testament. I've heard that cited several times. I've read it a few times, and I'm curious if you've heard that before, if you think it's true, and what that really means.
All right, so with early church letters, do you mean the documents of the New Testament?
Not the New Testament documents, but letters from
okay.
other church leaders.
I got you. What you're saying, let me see.
Okay,
I think I got you. You're
Church
saying
fathers.
that apart from the manuscripts that I've been talking about, the Bible is quoted by Eusebius, Tertullian, Origen.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah, and they quote it so much that if you took all those quotes out and arranged them properly, you could reproduce the New Testament.
Almost all of it is what I've heard
Yeah.
cited.
Yeah, that's a true statement. And I think that the value of the statement is that it shows us that there are a lot of ancient authors quoting the Bible a lot, right? And so it's worthy of reading, worthy of having a course on it at a school like this. It's not saying that the result of that work would give us a really accurate New Testament, okay? Because a lot of that would be Latin, some of it would be Syriac, a lot of it would be quoted from memory, and so it's a valuable statement in the sense that it reveals to us just how very much Bible quoting there's going on, but not in the sense of compiling a New Testament with the intent of accuracy.
But in your A, B, C, D ratings, sometimes they look at that evidence too, those witnesses. In other words, if it's a really early author, they might see how they quoted the book of Matthew.
That's a good point. So when you get to a C or D reading, all of a sudden the scholars need as much information as they can get. And so they do dive deeply into authors in addition to scribes. Thank you.
Okay, another question?
Yes, sir.
Yep, great.
In regards to the absence of Mark 16, 19 through 20, would older manuscripts be better, or would newer because it's left out in the oldest ones and it is there in the newest ones? And then would it be the short one that is just verse 20 following verse 8, or 9 through 20?
Okay,
including it
so
all?
to bring everybody in on this, and maybe it's been discussed on campus, I don't know. The Gospel of Mark ends in 5 different ways, and one of them ends at verse 8, short chapter, 8 verses, and then the most popular one is the one that goes 12 more verses and ends at verse 20, right? And the reason it's the most popular is because it's the one in the King James. And so the King James is all over the world, and I think you were just simply asking my opinion about that, right?
Yes, and going through the process of figuring out why I was looking at writer style and the introduction of certain characters.
Okay, yeah, you're on it. You're answering the question, and I appreciate it. So the main 3 ways to think through that are: number 1, to prefer older manuscripts over newer ones, and our oldest copies of Mark don't have it. It's a very small number that don't have it, but they're still the oldest. Number 2, to look at the style, and the last 12 verses of Mark are wildly different than all the rest of Mark in their style. And number 3 is to ask yourself, which is more likely? That somebody was dissatisfied with an 8-verse chapter that ends very abruptly, and so they've added to it to give it a satisfactory conclusion. That seems likely. Or the other possibility is that somebody had the full Gospel of Mark and they thought, this ends very nicely. It doesn't concern me at all. I think I'll chop 12 verses off and make it the world's most confusing textual problem. Of course, I phrased that in a way that helps my point of view. None of those 3 things are entirely conclusive, but the 3 together have made us, not everyone, but essentially all, way over 90% of New Testament scholars would say Mark 16 ends at verse 8. And thanks for that good question. Yeah, Mike. Professor Cahill.
Yeah, so knowing what you know about Mark, would you preach the last 12 verses?
Would I preach from the last 12 verses?
Yeah.
No. Partly because I only preach about once a year. Okay? And so it would be better to ask one of your preaching professors, or Corey, who's sitting over here, people who preach 50 times a year. But that's kind of a cop-out. More seriously, if I preached 50 times a year for 10 years, I wouldn't preach from verses that I was personally convinced were not from the author.
So we got time for one more question.
There's one over here.
Tim?
So if I was understanding your argument correctly during the manuscripts, you believe that the earlier manuscripts, ones from the 2nd century to the 7th century, add more validity to the text. An argument that I have heard against this is that the method of copying the text that the scribes used, mainly with the Old Testament, but that would have been carried over somewhat when Jews converted to Christianity and copied the text. The methods they used to copy it would hold very strongly to the manuscripts created that we found from the 8th to the 16th century. So even though they're almost a millennia removed from the original writing of the manuscript, since they were so meticulous in the way that they copied, those manuscripts would be very, very similar to the original manuscripts. What would be your response to that idea?
3 things. First of all, thank you so much for a question that shows that you've been thinking, listening, talking, reading about such things. All right? That's great. You're validating my presence here. Secondly, I would just simply say, no, that's not true. With all due respect to whatever source gave you that, it is true that medieval manuscripts they have a lot of differences that are betrayed, or not betrayed, but are revealed when you look at the earlier ones. Okay? So there is quite a bit of difference as time goes on. But the third thing I would say is just to back off a little bit from my first one, okay? Because when we have these discussions, we're having them about the differences. And so to hear someone like me say, oh, no, there's a lot of differences, runs the risk of recognizing that there's a lot of similarity. I mean, it's true that basically what people who don't agree with that would say is that the New Testament got longer over time. And that's a true statement. And so by the time you get to the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century, you're simply dealing with more words. It's accumulated text. But on the other hand, it didn't get very much longer. It got like, I don't know, off the top of my head, 3% longer or something like that. And so we're not talking about the bulk of words. We're talking about the differences. And so answer number 2, I'll stand by it, which is I disagree with that. But then I just want to be honest that here, it's like this, and maybe this is going to be our parting cry. It's not a great parting cry, but it's like comparing 2 people. We can go on and on and on about the differences. And if somebody were to say, well, no, they're the same, you'd say, well, of course they're not the same. I can list 50 differences. But let's not overlook the fact that there are like a million similarities between any 2 individuals. We're just not talking about that. We're not talking about the cells, right? And the 2 legs, 2 arms kind of stuff, right? So
Yep.
Thank you for your question.
Can I give an answer to that too, though? This is a little nastier answer. In that debate, the people that defend that later text from the 8th to the 16th century, that's a different textual tradition. We call it the Textus Receptus. That's the text that the King James Version was translated from. The most beloved translation ever in the history of the world, to the point that there are a lot of people who think the King James translation in and of itself is inspired. Not just a translation of the inspired Word of God, but the translation was inspired. I mean, after all, it's the translation that Paul used. So, no, that's a joke, sorry. And because of that, the defense of the King James translation is so important to them that they're going to defend the textual tradition used for it, which in the 1600s was a pretty enlightened step. I mean, they were doing the best that they could 400 years ago. Well, we have a lot better manuscripts today. We have a lot better research. We know a lot more, and we're much closer to the original text that Luke or Paul or John wrote than we were in the 1600s. So I just think it's a very strange argument that you take this kind of ill-begotten love for the King James Version as an inspired translation, and backwards you go to defend the Greek text behind it because of that. Okay, well, enough of that. So anyway, we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you.